Sarah Miller had always been the kind of daughter who called her parents every Sunday without fail. At 28, she worked as a nurse at the local hospital in Cedar Falls, Iowa, and lived in a small apartment just 15 minutes from her childhood home. Her parents, Robert and Linda Miller, couldn't have been prouder of their only child. She was responsible, caring, and had never given them a moment's worry. That's why when Sarah met David Chen at a medical conference in Chicago, her parents were naturally curious, but supportive. Sarah had always been selective about dating, focusing on her career and close friendships instead. But something about David seemed different. He was a traveling pharmaceutical sales representative, well-dressed and charming, with stories about cities he'd visited and people he'd met. Sarah would light up when she talked about him during their Sunday phone calls. The relationship moved quickly. Within 3 months, David was visiting Cedar Falls regularly, staying at Sarah's apartment and joining the family for dinner. Robert found him pleasant enough, though something felt off about the man's stories. David claimed to have lived in many different cities, but when Robert asked specific questions about places, David's answers seemed vague. Linda dismissed her husband's concerns, saying he was just being an overprotective father. David proposed after 6 months of dating. Sarah called her parents, breathless with excitement, describing the romantic dinner at an expensive restaurant in downtown Chicago. The ring was beautiful, she said, a vintage piece that David claimed had belonged to his grandmother. The wedding was planned for just 2 months later, which surprised everyone. But Sarah explained that David's work schedule made it difficult to plan far in advance. The wedding preparations were rushed but joyful. Sarah's best friend Emma helped with the arrangements, and Linda threw herself into planning the reception. David seemed oddly uninvolved in the details, claiming that he trusted Sarah's taste completely and that his own family couldn't attend, due to various circumstances. He mentioned his parents had died in a car accident years earlier, and his only brother was stationed overseas with the military. Robert tried to verify some of David's background through casual conversation. He asked about David's college, his previous jobs, and his family history. Each time, David provided answers that sounded reasonable but felt rehearsed. When Robert suggested they meet David's brother via video call, David explained that military communications were restricted. When Linda wanted to visit the graves of David's parents to pay respects, David became emotional and said it was too painful to discuss. The wedding day arrived on a beautiful Saturday in October. Sarah looked radiant in her grandmother's wedding dress, which Linda had carefully preserved for decades. The ceremony was held at the small Methodist church where Sarah had been baptized, with about 50 guests in attendance. David's side of the church was notably empty except for a few people he introduced as work colleagues. During the reception, Emma noticed something strange. She was talking to one of David's supposed colleagues, a man named Marcus, when she mentioned how romantic David's proposal story was. Marcus looked confused and said he'd heard a completely different version from David. When Emma pressed for details, Marcus seemed uncomfortable and changed the subject. She decided not to mention it to Sarah on her wedding day, not wanting to cause any drama. The newlyweds planned a honeymoon in Hawaii, a trip that David said was a surprise gift from his company for meeting sales targets. Sarah was thrilled, having never been to Hawaii before. They would leave the following Tuesday and be gone for 2 weeks. Sarah promised to call her parents from the hotel and send lots of pictures. Robert gave his daughter away with mixed emotions. He loved seeing Sarah so happy, but something nagged at him about David. During the father-daughter dance, Sarah whispered that she'd never felt so loved and protected. She thanked her father for raising her to recognize a good man when she saw one. Robert smiled and hugged her tighter, hoping his instincts were wrong. Linda cried happy tears as she watched her daughter dance with her new husband. David was attentive and seemed genuinely affectionate with Sarah. Maybe Robert was just having trouble letting go of their little girl. After all, Sarah was an intelligent, capable woman who could make her own decisions about love and marriage. The evening ended with Sarah and David leaving for their new apartment in Chicago, where they planned to live together. David had found them a place near his work, and Sarah had arranged to transfer to a hospital in the Chicago area. It was a big change, but Sarah seemed excited about starting this new chapter of her life in a bigger city. As the guests departed and the cleanup began, Emma approached Robert and Linda. She mentioned the strange conversation with Marcus, but suggested it might have just been a misunderstanding. Wedding days were stressful, and people sometimes got their stories mixed up. Still, she thought they should know, just in case. Robert filed this information away, his unease growing slightly stronger. The next morning, Sarah called to thank her parents for the beautiful wedding and to confirm their departure time for Hawaii. She sounded happy and excited, talking about all the places David wanted to show her on the islands. She promised to call from the hotel in Honolulu and said she couldn't wait to start their new life together. Linda asked if Sarah needed anything before the trip, offering to help her pack or run errands. Sarah laughed and said David was taking care of everything. He'd already arranged for their luggage to be picked up and had handled all the travel details. All she needed to do was show up at the airport with her passport and a smile. Tuesday. Morning came, and Robert and Linda drove to the airport to see the couple off. They found Sarah waiting alone at the departure gate, looking slightly anxious. David was running late, she explained, dealing with some last-minute work issues. He would meet her at the gate before boarding time. As the minutes ticked by and boarding began, Sarah's anxiety grew visible. Then David appeared, rushing and apologetic, with a garment bag and a briefcase. He barely had time to say goodbye to Robert and Linda before the final boarding call. Sarah hugged her parents quickly, promising to call from Hawaii, and disappeared down the jetway with her new husband. It would be the last time Robert and Linda would see their daughter for many months, and when they did see her again, the truth they discovered would shatter everything they thought they knew about David Chen and their daughter's marriage. The first week of silence didn't alarm Robert and Linda Miller too much. Sarah had mentioned she might be too busy exploring Hawaii to call every day, and they assumed the young couple was enjoying their honeymoon bliss. But when Sunday came, and went without their daughter's traditional weekly call, Linda began to worry. She tried calling Sarah's cell phone several times, but each call went straight to voicemail. The cheerful message in Sarah's voice felt both comforting and frustrating. Linda left messages asking Sarah to call back, but the hours stretched into another day with no response. When she tried calling the hotel in Honolulu that Sarah had mentioned, the front desk had no record of a reservation under Miller or Chen. Robert suggested that maybe David had booked under a different name, or perhaps they had changed hotels. Hawaii was full of beautiful resorts, and David seemed like the type to surprise Sarah with luxury accommodations. They decided to wait another few days before taking any action. After all, Sarah was a grown woman on her honeymoon. By the end of the second week, both parents were genuinely concerned. Linda called Sarah's former workplace at the Cedar Falls Hospital, hoping to get contact information for the Chicago hospital where Sarah was supposed to start working. The administrator was helpful, but confused. Sarah had given proper notice and mentioned her transfer, but she had never provided details about which Chicago hospital had hired her. Robert decided to take a more direct approach. He drove to Chicago and found the apartment address that David had given them. The building was real, but when he spoke to the landlord, he learned that no lease had been signed by anyone named David Chen or Sarah Miller. The apartment David had claimed was theirs was actually occupied by a family who had lived there for 3 years. This discovery sent both parents into a panic. Robert immediately called the Chicago police, but they explained that Sarah was an adult who had voluntarily left with her husband. Without evidence of foul play or a crime, they couldn't treat it as a missing person case. The detective suggested that perhaps the couple had decided to settle somewhere else and would contact the family when they were ready. Linda began calling hospitals throughout the Chicago area, asking if they had recently hired a nurse named Sarah Miller or Sarah Chen. The process was frustrating and time-consuming. Most hospitals wouldn't provide employee information over the phone, citing privacy policies. Those that did help had no record of anyone matching Sarah's description. Emma, Sarah's best friend, joined the search effort. She had kept in touch with other friends from the medical conference where Sarah had met David, and she began making calls to see if anyone else knew him or could provide additional information. The results were troubling. 2 people remembered David from the conference, but their descriptions of his background didn't match what Sarah had told her parents. One conference attendee, a doctor from Minnesota, remembered David claiming to be from Portland, Oregon, and mentioning previous work with a pharmaceutical company that had since gone out of business. Another person recalled David talking about having grown up in Texas. These inconsistencies painted a picture of someone who told different stories to different people. Robert hired a private investigator, a former police detective named Janet Walsh, who specialized in missing persons cases. Janet immediately began working to trace David Chen's background, but she quickly discovered that the information he had provided appeared to be fabricated. The pharmaceutical company he claimed to work for had no employee by that name. The Social Security number on the marriage license led to a deceased person. The investigation revealed that David Chen appeared to have multiple identities. Janet found evidence of similar names and backgrounds being used in other cities, always involving relationships with women who had subsequently disappeared from their communities. The pattern was disturbing and suggested that Sarah's situation was not unique. Meanwhile, Linda struggled with grief and guilt. She replayed every conversation with David, looking for signs she should have noticed. She blamed herself for not supporting Robert's instincts about their son-in-law. Sleep became difficult, and she found herself calling Sarah's phone just to hear her daughter's voice on the voicemail message. Janet Walsh's investigation expanded as she connected with law enforcement in other cities. In Phoenix, a woman named Jennifer had married a man with a similar background story who called himself Daniel Chang. Jennifer had disappeared during their supposed honeymoon, and her family had never heard from her again. In Atlanta, Lisa had married Derek Channing, and she too had vanished after the wedding. The FBI became involved when Janet presented evidence of a pattern spanning multiple states. Agent Maria Santos was assigned to the case and began coordinating with local law enforcement agencies. She explained to Robert and Linda that they were dealing with someone who appeared to be a professional con artist, possibly involved in human trafficking or other serious crimes. As the investigation deepened, more disturbing details emerged. The vintage engagement ring David had given Sarah was reported stolen from a jewelry store in Denver 6 months earlier. The hotel reservations for Hawaii had been made with a credit card linked to another false identity. Even the work colleagues who attended the wedding turned out to be actors hired for the occasion. The realization that their daughter had married a complete stranger, someone who had orchestrated an elaborate deception, was devastating for Robert and Linda. They struggled to understand how Sarah, who was normally so cautious and intelligent, had been fooled so completely. Janet explained that skilled con artists were experts at reading people and telling them exactly what they wanted to hear. 3 months after the wedding, Agent Santos called with an update. Investigators had identified the man known as David Chen as Marcus Thompson, a career criminal with a history of fraud, identity theft, and suspected involvement in human trafficking. He had been using various identities for over a decade, and Sarah was just the latest in a long line of victims. The news brought some relief in knowing who they were dealing with, but it also intensified their fears for Sarah's safety. If Marcus Thompson was involved in human trafficking, Sarah could be anywhere in the world. The investigation would require international cooperation and could take years to resolve. Linda began attending a support group for families of missing persons. She met other parents and spouses who had lived with uncertainty for years, some who had found their loved ones and others who were still searching. The group provided comfort, but also the sobering reality that not all missing person cases had happy endings. Robert threw himself into working with law enforcement, providing any information that might help track down Marcus Thompson and find Sarah. He learned about the underground networks that moved victims across borders and the challenges law enforcement faced in prosecuting international crimes. Every day brought new leads, but also new frustrations as the trail seemed to grow colder. The holidays approached, and the empty chair at the dinner table served as a constant reminder of Sarah's absence. Linda couldn't bring herself to take down the wedding photos, even though looking at them now felt like looking at evidence of an elaborate lie. The joy in Sarah's face in those pictures made the betrayal feel even more cruel. 6 months into the investigation, Agent Maria Santos received a breakthrough that would change everything. A woman named Rebecca Torres had contacted the FBI after seeing Marcus Thompson's photo in a missing persons database. Rebecca had escaped from a human trafficking operation in Mexico, and she recognized Marcus as one of the key organizers who had recruited American women for the network. Rebecca's testimony painted a horrifying picture of Marcus Thompson's operation. He would spend months carefully selecting victims, always choosing intelligent, successful women who had good relationships with their families but were somewhat isolated socially. He studied their backgrounds thoroughly, creating false identities that would appeal specifically to each target. Sarah fit the profile perfectly. According to Rebecca, Marcus would court his victims for several months, gaining their trust and love before proposing quick marriages. The weddings served multiple purposes. They provided legal cover for travel documents and made it easier to isolate the women from their support systems. Once married, he would convince them to move away from their families and friends, supposedly, for career opportunities or romantic adventures. The honeymoon was actually the beginning of the trafficking process. Marcus would take his new wives to foreign countries under the pretense of exotic travel, but once there, their identification documents would be confiscated, and they would be sold to human trafficking networks. The women were told that their families had been threatened, and that cooperation was the only way to keep their loved ones safe. Rebecca had been one of Marcus's victims 3 years earlier. She had married him under the name David Cheng in Portland, Oregon, after a whirlwind romance that followed the exact same pattern as Sarah's experience. Her family had also reported her missing when she disappeared after her wedding, but without Rebecca's cooperation, law enforcement had been unable to build a case. She explained that the trafficking network moved women between locations every few months to prevent them from forming relationships or learning enough about their surroundings to escape. Rebecca had been held in facilities in Mexico, Guatemala, and Costa Rica over a 2-year period. She had finally escaped during a transfer between locations when a transportation vehicle broke down near a police checkpoint. The information Rebecca provided allowed Agent Santos to coordinate with international law enforcement agencies. The network Marcus worked for was much larger than initially suspected, involving corrupt officials in multiple countries and sophisticated money laundering operations. Breaking it would require careful planning and simultaneous raids across several jurisdictions. Robert and Linda received updates about the investigation, but learning the truth about what had likely happened to Sarah was almost more devastating than not knowing. The thought that their daughter might be trapped in such a horrific situation, believing that her silence was protecting her family, was unbearable. Linda stopped sleeping entirely, and Robert took leave from his job to focus on the search. Janet Walsh, the private investigator, worked closely with the FBI to trace Marcus Thompson's movements after Sarah's disappearance. Financial records showed that he had purchased plane tickets to Mexico City using one of his false identities. From there, the trail became more difficult to follow, but investigators believed Sarah had been taken to a remote facility in the mountains of central Mexico. The Mexican authorities were initially reluctant to cooperate with American investigators, citing jurisdictional issues and concerns about sovereignty. However, Agent Santos had worked with international trafficking cases before and knew how to navigate the diplomatic channels. She emphasized that the network they were targeting had been operating in Mexico for years and was likely responsible for the disappearances of Mexican citizens as well. Emma continued her own investigation, focusing on social media and online networks. She discovered that Marcus had been active on professional networking sites under multiple identities, always targeting women in healthcare or education fields. His profiles were carefully crafted to appeal to intelligent, career-focused women who might be looking for stability and partnership. Through her online research, Emma connected with families of other victims. She found Jennifer's family in Phoenix and Lisa's family in Atlanta, and together they formed an informal support network. They shared information and resources, creating a database of Marcus's known aliases and methods. This grassroots investigation provided valuable information that complemented the official law enforcement efforts. The breakthrough came when Rebecca Torres agreed to work undercover with international investigators. She had maintained contact with some of the people involved in the trafficking network, and she offered to help identify key locations and operatives. This was extremely dangerous, as discovery would likely mean death, but Rebecca was determined to help rescue other women and bring the network down. Using information from Rebecca's undercover work, Mexican and American authorities identified a compound in the state of Michoacan where they believed Sarah and other trafficking victims were being held. Satellite surveillance confirmed unusual activity at the location, including vehicles arriving and departing at odd hours and security measures that seemed excessive for a rural property. Planning the rescue operation took weeks of careful coordination. The compound was located in an area controlled by local criminal organizations, and any law enforcement action would need to be swift and overwhelming to succeed. Mexican federal police worked with American agents to plan simultaneous raids on multiple locations connected to the trafficking network. Robert and Linda were informed about the planned operation, but were asked to maintain absolute secrecy. The success of the mission depended on surprising the traffickers, and any leak of information could endanger Sarah and other victims. The waiting during those final weeks was excruciating, knowing that their daughter might be just days away from rescue or that the operation could fail entirely. Agent Santos explained that even if the raid was successful, the victims would likely need extensive medical and psychological treatment. The trauma of trafficking often left survivors with complex mental health challenges, and the readjustment to normal life could take years. The families needed to be prepared for the possibility that their loved ones might not be the same people who had disappeared. The support group Linda attended helped prepare her for various scenarios. She met other families who had been reunited with trafficking victims, and their stories provided both hope and realistic expectations. Some survivors had recovered well and rebuilt their relationships with their families, while others struggled with trust issues and post-traumatic stress that affected all their relationships. On a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 7 months after Sarah's disappearance, Agent Santos called Robert and Linda Miller. The operation was scheduled to begin at dawn the following day, Mexican time. They would know the results within hours, but she warned them to prepare for any outcome. The compound had been under surveillance, but there was no guarantee that Sarah was still there or even still alive. That night, Robert and Linda sat together in their living room, surrounded by photos of Sarah and mementos from her childhood and adult life. They talked about their hopes and fears, their regrets, and their love for their daughter. Neither of them slept, but they held hands through the long hours, drawing strength from each other as they waited for news that would either reunite their family or confirm their worst fears. At dawn on Wednesday morning, Mexican federal police surrounded the compound in Michoacan, while American agents coordinated from a command center in Mexico City. The operation involved over 60 officers, helicopter support, and medical teams, standing by to assist any victims who might be found. Agent Santos maintained constant communication with her Mexican counterparts, knowing that timing would be critical to the mission's success. The compound was larger than satellite images had suggested, with multiple buildings connected by underground tunnels. The traffickers had clearly invested significant resources in creating a facility that would be difficult to assault and easy to defend. Intelligence suggested that armed guards patrolled the perimeter around the clock, and the main building had reinforced doors and barred windows. The first wave of officers breached the outer security fence at exactly 6 in the morning. They encountered immediate resistance from guards armed with automatic weapons, confirming that the traffickers were prepared for the possibility of law enforcement action. The sound of gunfire echoed across the rural landscape as officers fought their way toward the main buildings. Inside the compound, chaos erupted as traffickers began destroying evidence and attempting to move victims to secure locations. Some tried to escape through the tunnel system, while others barricaded themselves. In defensive positions, the operation that investigators had hoped would be swift and surgical quickly became a prolonged battle requiring additional tactical support. Sarah Miller was in a locked room on the second floor of the main building when the shooting started. She had been held at this location for 3 months, after being moved from 2 previous facilities. The sound of helicopters and shouting in Spanish initially terrified her, as she had learned to associate any disturbance with punishment or another forced relocation. For 7 months, Sarah had survived by following the rules her captors established. She had been told repeatedly that her family believed she was dead, and that any attempt to escape or resist would result in harm coming to her parents. The psychological manipulation had been as devastating as the physical captivity, leaving her uncertain about reality and afraid to hope for rescue. When Mexican officers finally reached her room and broke down the door, Sarah initially cowered in the corner, believing they might be more traffickers or that this was some kind of test. She had lost significant weight and showed signs of both physical and psychological trauma. The officers tried to reassure her in Spanish, but Sarah's language skills were limited, adding to her confusion and fear. Agent Santos received word that a woman matching Sarah's description had been found, but positive identification would have to wait until she could be safely evacuated from the compound. The battle with traffickers continued for several more hours, and moving victims out of the area remained dangerous until all resistance was eliminated. In total, the raid rescued 18 women from 7 different countries, ranging in age from 19 to 35. Most had been reported missing by their families, though some had been captured in different circumstances. The international nature of the victims confirmed the scope of the trafficking network and the need for continued cooperation between law enforcement agencies. Sarah was among the first victims evacuated by helicopter to a secure medical facility in Mexico City. She was conscious but disoriented, asking repeatedly about her parents and whether they were safe. Medical personnel provided initial treatment for malnutrition and dehydration, while psychologists began the delicate process of helping her understand that she was finally free. Agent Santos called Robert and Linda Miller 6 hours after the operation began. She confirmed that a woman believed to be their daughter had been rescued alive, but cautioned that positive identification and medical evaluation were still ongoing. The call brought overwhelming relief mixed with anxiety about Sarah's condition and what she might have endured during her captivity. The identification process required comparing physical characteristics, dental records, and eventually DNA testing to confirm that the rescued woman was indeed Sarah Miller. While medical personnel were confident based on physical appearance and personal details Sarah provided, official protocols required thorough verification before the family could be notified definitively. Sarah's psychological evaluation revealed the extent of her trauma. She exhibited symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and what psychologists called learned helplessness, resulting from months of captivity and manipulation. She had been repeatedly told that her cooperation was the only thing protecting her family from harm, and she struggled to believe that the rescue was real. The medical team worked carefully to help Sarah understand her situation. She needed time to process that the rescue was genuine, that her family was safe, and that the people caring for her were truly trying to help rather than manipulate her further. Trust had become nearly impossible for her after months of deception and control. Marcus Thompson was not captured during the raid on the compound. Evidence suggested that he had left Mexico weeks earlier, possibly after being warned that law enforcement was closing in on the operation. However, several key figures in the trafficking network were arrested, including the facility manager and several guards who had directly overseen the victims. The investigation revealed that Marcus had been using Sarah's nursing credentials to add legitimacy to medical aspects of the trafficking operation. Victims were often told they were being trained for medical work abroad, and Sarah's professional background made her particularly valuable to the traffickers in maintaining this deception with other women. Documents found at the compound showed the sophisticated nature of the operation. The traffickers maintained detailed records on each victim, including information about their families, their psychological profiles, and their potential value in different markets. Sarah's file contained personal information that Marcus had gathered during their courtship, including details about her parents and her relationship with them. The rescued women faced a complex process of repatriation to their home countries. Each required medical treatment, psychological counseling, and legal documentation to return home safely. The Mexican and American governments worked together to expedite the process, but bureaucratic requirements still meant that reunion with families would take several more weeks. Sarah was able to make her first phone call to her parents after 3 days of medical and psychological evaluation. The conversation was brief and emotional, with Sarah struggling to find words to express her relief at being safe and her love for her family. Robert and Linda could hear the trauma in her voice, but they were overjoyed simply to know that their daughter was alive. The call was monitored by medical personnel to ensure that Sarah wasn't overwhelmed by the emotional intensity of reconnecting with her family. They explained to Robert and Linda that Sarah would need time to readjust to normal relationships, and that her recovery would be a gradual process requiring professional support and family patience. Plans were made for Robert and Linda to travel to Mexico City to be reunited with Sarah before her return to the United States. Agent Santos arranged for them to work with specialists who could help them understand what Sarah had experienced and how they could best support her recovery. The reunion would be carefully managed to avoid overwhelming Sarah with emotions she might not be ready to handle. Other families of rescued victims began arriving in Mexico City, creating an unusual community of people united by tragedy, but celebrating miraculous reunions. The medical facility became a gathering place for families who had shared months of uncertainty and were now sharing the relief of having their loved ones return safely. Rebecca Torres, who had risked her life to provide information for the rescue operation, was present to help other victims understand their situation. Her presence was particularly important for women who had been held for extended periods and had difficulty accepting that their rescue was real. She served as living proof that survival and recovery were possible. Robert and Linda Miller arrived in Mexico City on a Friday afternoon, their emotions swinging between overwhelming joy and deep anxiety about seeing their daughter after 8 months of uncertainty. Agent Santos met them at the airport and briefed them during the drive to the medical facility about what they should expect. Sarah had made significant progress in her recovery, but she was still fragile and easily startled by unexpected sounds or movements. The reunion took place in a quiet room at the medical facility with a psychologist present to provide support, if needed. When Sarah saw her parents, she broke down completely, sobbing in a way that seemed to release months of suppressed emotion and fear. Robert and Linda held their daughter carefully, amazed by how thin she had become, but grateful beyond words simply to have her in their arms again. Sarah spoke haltingly about her experience, struggling to find words for trauma that seemed beyond description. She explained how Marcus had systematically isolated her from everything familiar, using her love for her family as a weapon against her. He had convinced her that her parents believed she was dead and that any attempt to contact them would put them in danger from his criminal associates. The psychological manipulation had been as damaging as the physical captivity. Marcus and his associates had created a false reality where Sarah's compliance was the only thing protecting the people she loved. She had been shown fake newspaper clippings reporting her death and fabricated police reports suggesting that her family had given up searching for her. The elaborate deception had left her questioning her own memories and perceptions. During her captivity, Sarah had been moved between 3 different locations in Mexico. The first facility was presented as a temporary safe house where she would wait while Marcus arranged their new life together. When weeks passed without the promised reunion, she was told that complications had arisen and that she needed to be patient for everyone's safety. At the second location, the pretense was gradually dropped, and Sarah began to understand the reality of her situation. She was no longer allowed to keep personal belongings or maintain any semblance of privacy. The other women at the facility came from different countries and backgrounds, but all had similar stories of being deceived by men who had promised them love and security. Sarah learned that some of the women had been held for years, moved regularly, between facilities to prevent them from developing relationships or learning enough about their locations to plan escapes. The psychological toll of this constant uncertainty and isolation was evident in all the victims, who showed varying degrees of depression, anxiety, and learned helplessness. The traffickers used a combination of threats, false promises, and carefully controlled information to maintain control over their victims. Women were told that their families were being watched and that any attempt to escape or resist would result in harm to their loved ones. They were also promised that cooperation would eventually lead to freedom, though this promise was never fulfilled. Sarah's nursing background made her particularly valuable to the operation. She was forced to provide basic medical care to other victims and to help maintain the facade that they were being cared for rather than exploited. This responsibility added another layer of trauma, as she was caught between trying to help other women and avoiding punishment from their captors. The third facility where Sarah was held during her final months of captivity was the most secure and isolating. Women were kept in individual rooms and allowed minimal contact with each other. Sarah spent most of her time alone, with only brief periods outside her room for meals and supervised activities. The isolation was intended to break down resistance and prevent the formation of bonds that might lead to collective action. During these months of solitude, Sarah struggled to maintain her sanity by creating mental routines and holding on to memories of her family and her previous life. She recited nursing procedures in her head, remembered conversations with her parents, and tried to keep track of time by observing changes in light and weather patterns through her small window. The rescue had initially terrified Sarah because she had been conditioned to fear any change in routine. The sound of helicopters and gunfire made her believe that her captors were moving her again, or that something terrible was happening. When Mexican officers broke into her room, she couldn't immediately understand that they were there to help her. Agent Santos explained to Robert and Linda that Sarah's reaction was typical of trafficking victims who had been held for extended periods. The psychological conditioning was designed to make victims afraid of rescue attempts and suspicious of potential helpers. Recovery would require patient work to rebuild Sarah's ability to trust and to help her distinguish between real and manufactured threats. The medical evaluation revealed that Sarah had lost over 30 pounds during her captivity and showed signs of malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies. More concerning were the psychological symptoms, including severe anxiety, depression, nightmares, and hypervigilance. She startled at unexpected sounds, had difficulty sleeping, and showed signs of what psychologists called complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Sarah's recovery began with basic medical care and gradual exposure to normal social interactions. She worked with bilingual therapists who specialized in trauma and trafficking survivors. The process was slow and sometimes frustrating, as Sarah would make progress one day only to retreat the next when memories or triggers overwhelmed her. Coping mechanisms. One of the most difficult aspects of Sarah's recovery was learning to trust her own perceptions again. Months of psychological manipulation had left her uncertain about reality and afraid to make decisions independently. Simple choices like what to eat or what to wear became sources of anxiety because she had been conditioned to believe that wrong decisions could have terrible consequences. Robert and Linda stayed in Mexico City for 2 weeks, working with Sarah and her medical team to prepare for her return to the United States. They learned about trauma responses, triggers to avoid, and strategies for supporting Sarah's recovery. The process was educational but emotionally exhausting as they confronted the reality of what their daughter had endured. The legal aspects of Sarah's case were complex, involving international law enforcement cooperation and testimony that would be needed for prosecuting the trafficking network. Sarah would eventually need to provide detailed statements about her captivity, but medical professionals insisted that this wait until she was psychologically stronger and better able to handle the stress of recounting her experiences. Marcus Thompson remained at large, but international law enforcement agencies had issued warrants for his arrest in multiple countries. Agent Santos explained that he would likely create new identities and continue his criminal activities unless he was captured. Sarah's case had provided valuable intelligence about his methods, which would help protect other potential victims. The other women rescued from the compound were also working through their own recovery processes. Some were reunited with families who had never stopped searching, while others faced the challenge of rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by their disappearance. Each woman's journey was unique, but they shared the common experience of surviving unimaginable circumstances and learning to trust the world again. Sarah asked to meet with Rebecca Torres before leaving Mexico. Rebecca had become a symbol of hope for trafficking survivors, proving that recovery and a meaningful life were possible after such trauma. Their conversation was private, but Sarah emerged from it with a renewed sense of determination to reclaim her life and help other women who might face similar situations. The day before Sarah's return to the United States, she had her first normal conversation with her parents that wasn't dominated by discussion of her captivity. They talked about small things like changes in their neighborhood and updates about family friends. These ordinary topics felt miraculous after months of uncertainty about whether they would ever have the chance to share such simple moments again. Sarah Miller returned to Cedar Falls on a cold Tuesday morning in April, 9 months after her wedding day disappearance. The homecoming was deliberately kept quiet, with only immediate family and close friends aware of her arrival. The media, attention surrounding the trafficking case had made privacy a priority, and Sarah needed time to readjust without the pressure of public scrutiny. The house where Sarah had grown up felt both familiar and strange to her. Everything was exactly as she remembered, but her perception had changed so dramatically that even safe, comfortable spaces felt overwhelming at first. Her childhood bedroom had been preserved exactly as she left it, but Sarah found herself unable to sleep there initially, preferring the living room couch where she could see all the exits and hear anyone approaching. Robert and Linda had spent weeks preparing for Sarah's return, working with trauma counselors to understand how they could best support her recovery. They learned that healing would be a long process, with setbacks and breakthroughs, and that their expectations needed to be realistic rather than hopeful. Love and patience would be more important than trying to return to their previous family. Dynamic immediately, Sarah began working with Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a psychologist who specialized in treating trafficking survivors. The sessions were difficult, as Sarah had to confront not only the trauma of her captivity, but also the shame and self-blame that many victims experience. She struggled with questions about why she had trusted Marcus so completely and whether she could have recognized the warning signs her father had noticed. Dr. Walsh helped Sarah understand that skilled predators like Marcus were experts at reading people and exploiting their desires and vulnerabilities. The deception had been carefully planned over months, and Sarah's trust was a normal response to someone who had studied her psychology and crafted his approach specifically to appeal to her. Her intelligence and caring nature had been used against her, not signs of weakness or poor judgment. The physical recovery was easier than the psychological healing, With proper nutrition and medical care, Sarah regained weight and strength relatively quickly. However, the anxiety, nightmares, and hypervigilance persisted for months. Loud noises, unexpected visitors, and even affectionate touches could trigger panic responses that reminded everyone how deeply the trauma had affected her. Emma proved to be an invaluable part of Sarah's support system. As her closest friend, Emma understood Sarah's personality before the trauma and could help her reconnect with aspects of herself that felt lost. They started with simple activities like watching movies together, gradually building up to more complex social interactions as Sarah's comfort level increased. The legal proceedings against the trafficking network moved slowly through international courts. Sarah would eventually need to testify about her experiences, but prosecutors agreed to delay her testimony until she was psychologically prepared. The evidence collected during the raid was substantial enough to proceed with many charges without immediately requiring victim testimony. 6 months after her return, Sarah made the difficult decision to speak publicly about her experience. Working with victim advocacy groups, she participated in a carefully managed interview that focused on raising awareness about trafficking tactics rather than sensationalizing her personal trauma. The interview was broadcast nationally and helped other families recognize warning signs that might indicate similar situations. The response to Sarah's interview was overwhelming. Families contacted law enforcement with information about missing relatives whose disappearances followed similar patterns. Several women came forward to report that they had been approached by men using tactics similar to Marcus Thompson's methods. The publicity also generated new leads about Marcus's whereabouts and other criminal activities. Dr. Walsh noted that speaking publicly about her experience marked an important step in Sarah's recovery. Rather than hiding from what had happened, to her, she was choosing to use her experience to help others. This sense of purpose and agency was crucial for survivors who needed to reclaim control over their lives and find meaning in their suffering. The investigation into Marcus Thompson's network continued to expand. International law enforcement agencies identified connections to trafficking operations in Asia, Europe, and South America. The scope of the criminal enterprise was much larger than initially suspected, with hundreds of potential victims and millions of dollars in illegal profits. 1 year after her rescue, Sarah made another important decision about her future. She chose to return to nursing, but with a focus on providing care for trauma survivors and other vulnerable populations. She enrolled in additional training programs to specialize in trauma-informed care and victim advocacy. The work was emotionally challenging but gave her a sense of purpose that aided her continued recovery. Robert and Linda also found ways to channel their experience into helping others. They became involved with organizations that support families of missing persons and trafficking victims. Linda started a support group for parents dealing with similar situations, while Robert worked with law enforcement agencies to improve protocols for missing person investigations. The Miller family's ordeal brought unexpected connections with other families who had faced similar tragedies. They maintained relationships with several families they had met during the investigation and recovery process. These connections provided ongoing support and reminded them that they were not alone in their experience of trauma and recovery. 2 years after her rescue, Sarah received news that Marcus Thompson had finally been arrested in Thailand, where he had been operating under yet another false identity. He was found with documents suggesting he was planning to target women in Bangkok's international business community. His arrest brought a sense of closure, though Sarah had already moved forward with her life regardless of whether he would ever face justice. The trial of Marcus Thompson became an international sensation, with media coverage highlighting the sophisticated methods used by human traffickers and the devastating impact on victims and their families. Sarah chose to testify via video link rather than appearing in person, a decision that allowed her to contribute to the prosecution while protecting her ongoing recovery. Marcus was ultimately convicted on multiple charges, including human trafficking, fraud, kidnapping, and identity theft. He received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. While the legal victory was satisfying, Sarah had learned that her healing didn't depend on external validation or justice. Her recovery was about reclaiming her own life, not waiting for others to be punished for their crimes. 3 years after her return, Sarah married again, this time to a fellow nurse named Michael, whom she met through her trauma advocacy work. The ceremony was small and private, attended only by family and close friends. The contrast with her first wedding was stark, but the genuine joy and careful consideration that went into her second marriage showed how far she had come in her recovery. The experience had changed the entire Miller family in profound ways. They had learned about resilience, the importance of community support, and the complex process of healing from trauma. While they would never choose to repeat their ordeal, they found meaning in using their experience to help others and to advocate for better protection of vulnerable people. Sarah's story became part of training materials used by law enforcement agencies to help identify trafficking situations and by advocacy groups to educate the public about predatory tactics. Her willingness to share her experience, despite the personal cost, helped protect other potential victims and supported other survivors in their own recovery journeys. The Miller family still lived with the effects of their trauma, but they had built a new normal that incorporated their experience while allowing them to move forward with hope and purpose. Sarah's disappearance had torn their world apart, but their journey through crisis and recovery had ultimately made their family bond stronger and their commitment to helping others deeper than ever before.